This video is not intended to dismiss those who are looking forward to this game. It is not intended to tell you that you are wrong for liking this game. It is intended as a complete explanation as to why I do not enjoy this game and feel that it fails in some key areas. I've met a number of people within the Monster Hunter community. Some are excited for the new release, others are more apprehensive. I also have made and plan to make more Monster Hunter content on the channel. As such, this video is partially made as a cohesive explanation on my thoughts on Rise as an easy reference point to whenever I'm asked what I think of the game, but also to maybe illustrate why many people are not interested in it. If you're someone who likes it, then maybe I can help you see the other side, and if you don't like it, then maybe I can help you understand as to why. After all, not everyone can articulate why they do or do not like something. Because of the timing of this video and the nature of the title, I want to dedicate some time to explain why it is possible to judge games without playing them. And to do so, I'm going to don my best pseudo-intellectual hat and talk about narratology and ludology. If you're already firmly in the camp of you don't need to play a game to be able to understand it to a degree, then I recommend skipping to the next chapter. If, however, you believe that it is not possible to understand a game without playing it, then this chapter is going to be crucial. Skipping over it will make the rest of the video make no sense to you and you'll likely never understand my perspective on the game. Narratology and ludology. This is a topic that gets discussed even in academic circles. That's not to say that it's the be-all end-all, but rather to say I'm not just pulling this stuff out of my ass. There is precedence for this kind of conversation. To put it simply, narratology is the idea that you can learn how a game plays, functions, and even its qualities and shortcomings solely from second-hand accounts. As in, reading about the game and listening to what other people have to say about it. A way of judging a game without playing it. A common example of this would be a review for a video game. You don't play the game yourself, but you get all of the necessary information to be able to make a judgment on the game. That is the purpose of a review. To pass on the information from the person who has played it to the person who has not played it. Ludology is the opposite, saying that the only way to understand a game is to play it, and no amount of reading and second-hand information will give you an accurate picture of the game's quality. The truth is obviously a mixture of the two. I don't need to play a platformer where the jump button only works 50% of the time to be able to conclude that it is a bad platformer. However, unless I try to perform an alleged difficult combo in a fighting game, I will never truly understand how difficult it is to perform. All I can say is, everyone else says it's hard, so it must be hard. The combo is an example where the tangibility of pressing the buttons plays an important part of understanding its qualities, whereas the platformer is an example of something that does not need the tangibility of pressing buttons to understand it is bad. Its quality is something that can be concluded entirely with theoretics, as in understanding the implications of a button working only 50% of the time. This kind of thing can be scaled into more complicated things, such as the addition of base camps in Monster Hunter. Obviously, with the increase in complexity from an implication standpoint, it makes dissecting the mechanic and understanding the interactions it has on the rest of the game a much more difficult task, but not impossible. Let's start with how the healing works, partially because later segments require an understanding of how it works, but partially because it's the easiest to demonstrate its effects in-game. I have two major issues with the healing in this game. For starters, it's way too strong. I would be astounded if they did not nerf this before release. As it stands right now, a single potion heals about 20% of your character's max health in an instant and then restores another 30% or so throughout the duration of the animation. At any point, the player can roll cancel the animation to avoid being punished for healing at a bad time. But if the player restores a third of their life instantaneously and can then roll cancel out of the rest of the animation, it makes it extraordinarily hard for monsters to punish a bad heal attempt, and as such makes the game significantly easier for everyone while simultaneously making everyone a lazier player. What do I mean by making people lazier players? If a player can get away with healing even at inopportune moments, then they'll be incentivized to continue healing at inopportune moments instead of waiting for a much safer opportunity. Sure, this makes it so you can get back into the fight faster, but it also means you don't have to pay attention to the monster's patterns as much to find a big opening, since you no longer need a big opening to be able to heal. It means you're more likely to spam heal even if the monster is about to hit you because you don't fear being knocked out of your heal, because being knocked out of your heal is very rare. This idea can also be extended to weapon sheathing, since that too has been greatly sped up and grants much higher mobility than it has done in classic Monster Hunter. No longer do you need to think about when to sheath, you just sheath. It becomes something the player does on autopilot because it's incredibly low risk. And what happens when a player puts a habit on autopilot? It becomes incredibly difficult to break. But also, if a fight suddenly requires the player to switch off that habitual autopilot, it makes it very suddenly very difficult, as you're now getting hit by stuff that you feel that you shouldn't be. Why do you feel this way? Because you haven't been hit like that in over 20 hours, and now, even if you can recognize your bad habit, you can't break it that easily. Playing lazily also makes you more prone to stubborn behavior, which is counterintuitive to learning new skills. If this one tactic has worked for every monster in my 40-hour playthrough so far, then it should work here. But not every monster plays the same. Many monsters require you to completely change your strategy when fighting them compared to other monsters. This is something the series has historically been very good at. In the large roster of monsters, there are very few fights outside of clone monsters, such as subspecies and the like, that incentivize the same strategy. While Diablos and Tigrex want to run you through over and over, Tigrex is very low to the ground and moves slower than Diablos, making it impossible to roll through him when he charges. Instead, it's a good idea to run out of his path or duck under his arm. While they are similar in attack patterns and even some counter strategies, they require the player to approach them differently. But if you're autopiloting, changing that strategy is going to require more effort than if you went into the fight already thinking about what you need to change. Designing a game that does not allow players to be lazy in some way is very difficult to do, and probably wouldn't be very enjoyable for very long. Being able to put some actions into autopilot or even a flowchart state of mind allows players to conserve mental energy. We only have so much energy after all, so autopiloting is not necessarily bad. As with most things, context is important. It's not bad to have a flowchart that says when Rathalos enrages, throw a flash bomb. I know that when Rathalos enrages, he enters the sky after throwing a fireball, leaving him very vulnerable to being flash bombed since he's stuck in the animation of throwing the fireball and can't turn away from it, guaranteeing a dunk and wasting time on his rage. It's a very powerful option for dealing with Rathalos. It is a strategy specific to the Wraths due to their behavior upon enrage, however, it is still a flowchart. If X, then Y. If enrage, throw flash. However, notice that it does not incentivize a lazier playstyle, because it is specific to Wraths. It's not a one strategy fits all and requires an understanding of the specifics of a particular monster. It's a strategy born from thinking more about a fight, not less. This is the kind of flowcharting that is good for a game, as it took effort to find a solution to a repeatable problem that is context specific. Being low on life is a universal problem, and as such, having a flowchart based around it needs to be more carefully considered as to not incentivize the creation of a lazy one. To make an example of this, let's look at the healing flowcharts in both new and classic Monster Hunter. In new style Monster Hunter, the healing flowchart looks like this. If low on life, heal. If monster attacks mid-heal, roll cancel. The player acts first without considering what the monster will do until the action is already in progress. Little to no understanding of the monster's attack pattern is required here, even when you get attacked mid-heal. Compare this to the healing flowchart of classic Monster Hunter. If low on life, wait for a large window in monster's attack pattern, heal. This flowchart respects the monster's ability to dunk on the player for healing at the wrong time, but also requires the player to have an understanding of the monster's attack pattern in order to spot when the healing window becomes available. It incentivizes the player to be more observant, to put more effort into understanding the game, to be less lazy. The sheer amount of healing given for an action that can be roll cancelled out of while retaining the healing properties of the heal is ludicrous. It could be argued that you get a similar amount of healing effectiveness in classic titles with max potions and the such, but I'd remind you that they cost some components that take some time to accumulate. Meanwhile, a mega potion in Rise only costs 1 herb and 1 honey with 100% craft chance in the field and will restore about 30% of your health in an instant and the rest over time, all the while being able to roll cancel out of it. There is not a single item in classic Monster Hunter that you can roll cancel out of using, regardless of how strong or weak they are. The problems that are presented by the effectiveness of healing in Rise is amplified by the ease of crafting and the presence of the base camps. As an addendum to this healing topic, Mauler made a fantastic video response series to HBomberGuy's In Defense of Dark Souls 2 video, of which a portion was dedicated to how healing works in the Souls series. As much of a meme as it is to compare games to Dark Souls, the healing in these two franchises share significant similarities in how they are intended to be used, and I thought the following segment was so poignant in talking about healing that I'll just let Mauler do the talking.
Should it be challenging to heal? It really depends on where you're arguing from. Are you asking from a standpoint of whether it is fun to heal in video games as a mechanic? Health bars are an established aspect of video games. The health bar represents your mistake allowance. In Dark Souls, it is also mediated in tandem with your armor and resistances. The reason we have healing items and mechanics is to restore our mistake allowance, but if healing were challengeless, then why not simply give us a health bar representative of the amount of health we would have if healing was added to the bar and remove healing altogether? Making healing difficult acts as the punishment for making the mistake in the first place and trying to essentially undo it. This moves to the second sentence, in which he declares that it is a fair system, but asks whether the system is good when healing is a bad idea that would itself kill you. This is a very weak way to structure your argument. Healing cannot be strictly considered a bad idea that would itself kill you. It is a deal you make with the item itself. A deal that you will receive the reward of reinstating your mistake allowance, and in exchange, the item expects you to sacrifice seconds of your time and movement. To allot a free space of a select amount of seconds, you will need to understand your enemy and react to them. It is undeniable that if you take a hit during battle or evasion of an enemy in the game, then it is your fault. Perhaps not 100% of the time, but mostly, as this is what the Souls games are predicated upon. Ultimately, your health is your responsibility, and each of the games in the Soulsborne series make that clear. How difficult it is to heal is down to the player. The healing will only become something pressing if you take the hit in the first place. The most pressing thing in the battle is winning the battle, and subsequently the operations that come with that, including attacking, defending, moving, positioning, healing, and timing all of it. So not only is it not the most pressing thing, but it is not a bad idea either. It'll be good or bad based on the player's decision to use it at particular times. We then move on to the more frustrating part of his argument. A lot of early players will die while mashing the heal button. That's not fun. I find this absolutely dumbfounding. It isn't fun to be hit when trying to dodge attacks, or to lose stamina to the point of breaking your own shield block, or to be hit while trying to attack something, or to die. These things shouldn't really be fun. They are counterweights to the enjoyment of the game itself. The lows help define the highs, and vice versa. The highs in this case would be to successfully land that attack, to successfully find the opening to heal, to successfully defeat the enemy. Of course, healing isn't fun when you get hit during it, however, I don't believe that it is meant to be fun. Losing health in the majority of games is not something that is desired. But he does add the caveat on the end. A lot of early players die while mashing the healing button. That's not fun, even if simply not doing that is technically the sound response. If someone is dying when healing, then advise them to stop healing when they're not safe. This is the experience running as intended, while also acting as a fantastic risk versus reward system. Whether it is fun or not is completely irrelevant because of the satisfaction it creates in the result of winning the battle after healing successfully and using your understanding of the battle at hand.
If you're interested in hearing more about healing in games, but more specifically Dark Souls, there'll be a link in the description to the full video. It's very long and in-depth, but if you're willing to watch this video, then I imagine video length isn't much of a dissuader for you and you should have no problem watching Maulers. Moving on from healing, let's talk about crafting. Crafting in Rise is very simple, requiring cheap, common components and are always guaranteed crafts. Components are always in the same spot and do not require RNG to obtain. I don't dislike this aspect as it makes farming runs take less time. However, I do believe that making crafting recipes simpler is a detriment, as it makes it significantly easier to acquire very powerful items. Couple this with the guaranteed craft rates in the game and it makes crafting consumables, especially in the field, incredibly powerful. No longer do you need to sacrifice item slots to guarantee item crafts, you just craft the item with no second thought. In classic Monster Hunter, it was an active decision as to whether you bring craft books or not. If you bring them, then you guarantee the item craft, but you might have to leave some items behind. It was a decision rooted in the player's desire to be prepared for the hunt. This preparation aspect of Monster Hunter is something I believe to be crucial to the experience, so allow me to go on a tangent as I explain. The core pillars to determine a player's skill in Monster Hunter are game knowledge, combat expertise, and preparation. Game knowledge is pretty self-explanatory. The more you know about the game, the better you are. If you know Rathalos is vulnerable to flash bombs, that's knowledge you can use to your advantage. If you know that Kirin is an Elder Dragon, you know not to try and trap it, as it will do nothing. Combat expertise is the one pillar that has the most crossover with the others. After all, if you lack knowledge of a monster's moveset, then it makes it difficult to dodge and punish. But even without that knowledge, a player with good combat expertise can still succeed if they're good at timing dodges and are able to observe a monster's habits to be able to exploit them. Preparation is the hardest to spot in players, but is arguably the most important. This is the thing you do before a hunt, and as such requires good game knowledge too. If you know that Rathalos is vulnerable to flash bombs, but you don't prepare flash bombs beforehand, then that knowledge is more or less going to waste. Good preparation sees a player using a weapon to exploit elemental weaknesses, bring items that the monster is weak to, bringing restoratives to counter status effects, and eating before a hunt. Bad preparation sees a player forgetting to restock their items before the hunt, forgetting to eat, and not bringing cool drinks to the desert. Each of these skills complement each other, but can also supplement them. Poor preparation can be remedied with good combat expertise, as even players who exclusively use full sets can perform quite well at endgame. Players with poor combat expertise can use their game knowledge to prepare powerful items and equipment sets beforehand to give themselves an easier time in the fight. With the ease of crafting, the need for good preparation has significantly decreased since it's more than easy to craft the necessary items in the field, rather than asking a teammate to lend theirs. This is something that will be brought up again when I talk about base camps, but for now, I'd like to pay lip service to a particular consequence of reducing the necessity for good preparation. That being how it severely reduces interactions between other players. If you forget a cool drink or run out of ammo in New Monster Hunter, you can easily craft more or go back to the base camp. In Classic, you'd either restart the hunt or you'd ask someone to share their cool drinks or carry some ammo and or crafting materials on your behalf. That kind of camaraderie of players helping each other is what makes cooperative games like Monster Hunter so special in the first place. Playing with other players that you cannot interact with makes the game feel more isolating. The more interaction between players is incentivized, the more players will want to work together. Of course, this is another one of those context-sensitive design decisions, but it's still something to be designed. For those who played the multiplayer of both World and Classic Monster Hunter, I'd like to ask you which game you found to be more sociable. From personal experience, it's Classic. This is partially due to how SOS flares worked in World, along with the sheer size of lobbies making socializing redundant. But there was also a lack of socialization within a hunt. No need to give healing items or ammo since the player can just go back to base camp to restock or make more in the field. I believe Rise is going back to the 4-player hubs, which will certainly bring back some socializing due to the intimacy of 4-player hubs, but I highly doubt it will reach the same level of classic titles that made items harder to obtain in the field. Since we've been talking about making items easier to obtain in the field, let's talk about base camps. Everything that I feared about base camps being in Rise has come true. There is, as of right now, no limit to the amount of items you can restock. You can eat meals, presumably even after being KO'd, and you can swap your equipment presumably as many times as you like. Let's start off with the consumables first, since it directly relates to the previous topic of crafting. If the power that each healing item possesses and their ease of crafting wasn't crazy enough, you can restock as many as you want whenever you visit the base camp. So not only is healing incredibly strong, but it is also incredibly plentiful, meaning that unless a monster can one-shot you or hit you with a touch of death combo, it is going to be very difficult to fail a quest from carting. This was something that was prevalent in World. They ended up giving more monsters one-shots and touch of death combos along with buffing their health, and in Iceborne, they greatly increased their health and gave a lot of monsters terrible hit zones to incentivize use of the Clutch Claw. All of these factors culminated in a game that actively punished defensive sets. Damage was heavily rewarded due to monsters' high health pools and bad hit zones, while defense was not rewarded enough due to the incredible damage these monsters did while requiring a lot of damage to be dealt in return in order to defeat them in a reasonable time, regardless of if you were speedrunning them or not. This damage-heavy meta was unfortunately also reflected in the weapons that were used, which is to say there was a very low variety of endgame viable weapons. This emphasis on playing the meta also had the adverse effect of weakening the community. Almost every community has its elitists in it, and Monster Hunter is no stranger to that. However, previous titles have always been more open to a variety of viable strategies in their endgame. With Iceborne being very limited in its viable options, it puts more pressure on players to conform to the meta if they desire success. This pressure leads to an expectation that everyone follows said meta and leads to players becoming elitist about following the meta. Obviously there's no guarantee that Rise's endgame will play out like this. However, there is precedent for it occurring due to the powerful and plentiful nature of healing items within the game. Prove me wrong, Capcom. I'd like nothing more than the endgame of Rise to be considered the best endgame in Monster Hunter in years. And with lacking a good segue, I'm now going to talk about the ability to eat meals at base camp, which is going to go back to the preparation skill that I was talking about earlier in the video. I understand the perspective that it's a pain to restart if you forget to eat, but that could be remedied with items such as max potions, mega dash juice, demon drugs, and armor skin. The ability to eat even after being KO'd also neglects this aspect. The point of meals in classic Monster Hunter is that your first life is your most powerful as a result of not being able to eat again. Giving up because you don't have a meal skill is looked down upon because, as with most games, putting in effort, even if you lack skill, is seen as a good thing. Meritocracy and all that. Effort and skill is rewarded, laziness and a lack of skill, for the most part, is punished. Simply put, forgetting to eat before a hunt is usually not that big of a deal if you have items that can remedy it. Again, going back to those preparation skills, and being able to eat mid-hunt even after being KO'd the first time makes your first life in a hunt have significantly less meaning to it. As far as things that the base camp does that I think are detrimental go, the meals is probably the one that I can look past the most. Being able to swap out equipment, on the other hand, is something that I think should not be allowed at all. Bringing the wrong equipment to a fight varies anywhere from a minor inconvenience to a crippling mistake. It's something that can be so significant to a hunt, and one with a clear visual indicator as to whether or not you did it correctly. Obviously, I'm talking about the armor and weapons your hunter is carrying. You could call it harsh to punish someone that badly for simply forgetting something, but the act of rewarding or punishing a player's ability to remember things exists in almost every game ever. Even the process of recognizing a monster's moveset is a reward for remembering something. Forgetting what buttons to press to store your Charge Blade files will have you fumbling around, wasting time until you get it right. Perhaps I'm biased in that the equipment I bring to a hunt is the first thing I think about before readying up for said hunt. I think to myself, what equipment do I want to fight this quest with? And that's a question I think is very healthy for Monster Hunter as a series to ask of its players. This goes back to the autopiloting topic a little. If a game does not make its players make meaningful decisions, then it's not very good at being a game. Hell, this is one of those things that make people argue that walking simulators are not games, in that they don't have the player making meaningful gameplay decisions, and that in order to be a game, it must have meaningful gameplay decisions. Tangent aside, bringing the right equipment to a quest is one of the strongest cases of the preparation skill I keep raving about, and is most poignantly showcased in multi-monster quests. Do I bring a set that deals incredibly well with that one monster that gives me hell, but conversely makes it harder to fight the other two? Or do I bring something that'll have consistent success across all three monsters? The ability to change your equipment mid-hunt completely invalidates this decision-making process, as the most effective thing to do will be to swap to the most effective set against the first monster, swap to the most effective set against the second monster, and so on. What do you sacrifice? Time? I don't bite. Unless you're a speedrunner, time is unlikely to be something that is not worth sacrificing. I know not everyone will abuse this system, but its presence alone alters the way the game is designed and could introduce some very silly interactions. I myself have strong memories of spamming the tent in World to cheese Tempered Kirin with a sleep bombing bow set in about 5 minutes per run. Case in point, Alatreon in Iceborne, arguably the monster who best suited the ability to change equipment mid-hunt due to his ever-changing elemental weaknesses. However, if players could change their equipment mid-hunt, it would make it a cakewalk. Therefore, it was decided that the only time players could return to the base camp was if they died, so they added the ability to swap equipment mid-hunt, but then had to disable it for a specific fight because it would have been too powerful. If that's not an admission that this mechanic has serious design implications, then I don't know what will. I don't even think it was necessarily a bad decision. To be honest, I've never played Iceborne, but from what I hear, Alatreon may well have been a joke if they let you change mid-hunt like normal. That said, these issues can be remedied. In fact, some of them already have been to an extent. There only exists one base camp, meaning that if you want to use these features, you do have to sacrifice a good amount of time since you cannot fast travel to the nearest one. As previously stated, I don't think it's much of a sacrifice, but it's good to see the camps are limited in some way. Previously, I thought the only thing that could be done to remedy these issues would be simply remove the base camps, and while I still would prefer they didn't exist at all, I recognize that some players like them and that, for better or worse, they're in the game. There is a way to have base camps, but limit them in such a way so as to not make them as ridiculous as they currently are. Firstly, limit the number of consumables that can be restocked. This will make it so your healing is at the very least limited. It won't change how powerful it is, but it will slightly reduce its abundance. Secondly, only allow meals to be eaten on your first life. This way you can still grab a meal in the field in case you forgot to do so pre-hunt, but it also keeps the classic style of making your first life the most powerful one. Lastly, make it so you can only change equipment once and within a certain time window. Similar to the meals, it retains the importance of choosing your equipment while not punishing you if you forgot to do so pre-hunt. If the game comes out and it does these or similar things, then I don't think base camps will have any major issues. If not, however, it could cause balancing problems later down the line. Something else that can cause balancing problems, and is something that every game with a controllable character has to consider, is mobility. The higher the player's mobility, the more powerful they become in relation to the rest of the game. What do I mean by mobility? Any kind of movement that the player can perform, both horizontally and vertically at any given time. Walking, running, sprinting, rolling, hopping, jumping, aerial vaulting, insect glaive vaulting, climbing. The greater the distance and the greater the number of options, the stronger. Even the direction of your dodge can have drastic changes. If, in the middle of your attack combo, you can only roll left, right, or forward, your options for evading monsters' attacks are more limited, and as such the player is made weaker in relation to a game with 4 roll directions. In Monster Hunter, the dodge has very few invulnerability frames, meaning that you want to have your body pass through an attack as quickly as possible so as to not get clipped by its lingering hitbox. In order to do this, you usually want to dodge into the attack. Let's use a wide sweep as an example. You want to dodge into the direction that the sweep is coming from. If you dodge into the direction the sweep is heading towards, you'll end up chasing a moving hitbox. As you chase the hitbox, the invulnerability frames in your dodge will expire, but the damaging frames of the attack will not. When your dodge frames do expire, your body will still be in the middle of the attacking hitbox and you'll take damage. This is an example of dodging in the wrong direction. So let's try and not do that. But if you only have 3 directions you can dodge in, you're going to have to make a quick decision as to which direction will be best. Which one will keep you safe and put you in a good position after it's done. After all, there are a lot of multi-hit attacks in Monster Hunter. Sometimes if you dodge the first hit of an attack, you'll end up getting clipped by the second because your dodge put you in a bad position. Due to the somewhat unpredictable nature of the monsters in these games, and the limitations on the dodge, it keeps the act of dodging something that you have to consciously think about, and rarely something that can be put on autopilot until you really learn how a fight works. If the dodge was omnidirectional, had twice as many invulnerability frames, and a much shorter recovery window, it would be busted. I'm sure everyone could see why, as it's a very dramatic change and very obviously would break the game if it wasn't designed around. This is where things start to get a little bit more tricky. Monster Hunter World and Rise have 4 directions a player can dodge in the middle of their combo. Movement options in Monster Hunter are restricted to weapons themselves. Only the longsword can fade slash, only the insect glaive can vault, etc. And while every weapon could only dodge in 3 directions in the middle of a combo, what those dodges actually were tied to the weapon. While all weapons shared side dodges, some of them used side hops and others used side rolls. As for the third dodge, most dodged forwards, while the lance and gun lance dodged backwards. These differentiations help make each weapon distinct and feel different. Every weapon already has a unique moveset that the player has to think about using, but if their dodges are also weapon specific, that also makes using each weapon distinct. While having all weapons share similar dodge properties, such as the ability to dodge in 4 directions, does not stop weapons from being unique, it most certainly detracts. It also makes every weapon stronger. As previously stated, the more mobility a player has, the more powerful they become in relation to the game. The ability to dodge in all 4 directions makes it harder, but not impossible, to define places in which a weapon is stronger or weaker. If the best option is to dodge forward, but your weapon can't, you're going to have to come up with a different solution. And Monster Hunter is usually well designed enough to give players multiple solutions. It has to be said, I can understand why they would make this change. More universal movement mechanics makes it easier to transfer skills from one weapon to another. I just think it takes away some key decision making. Some movement that I think is less arguable is the healing and sheathing. We've talked about it before, so it's no surprise it'd come up again in the movement section, and it's because it is a direct result of the movement that the healing is as powerful as it is. Not only can you roll cancel out of the heal after you've already received a huge amount of health from it, but you also have 360-degree movement and can even speed up your movement by sprinting. Monster Hunter is already a game where you can reasonably avoid a ton of attacks simply by moving out of the way of them. So to be able to move out of the range of attacks while also healing completely negates the risk of the action in the first place. Healing is supposed to be a decision you make consciously knowing it's a risk. How is healing a risk in classic Monster Hunter? By removing your mobility options for a period of time. You can't roll, sprint, or even do something as simple as walking, because even walking has power. To demonstrate this, I'm going to use an example from fighting games. The shimmy is a strategy used to try and bait throw attacks. You walk into throw range of your opponent sees this and thinks you're going for a throw, you then back out of the throw range, and as you do, your opponent goes for a throw tack. They whiff the throw, and then you punish with an attack. This is a part of the fundamental rock paper scissors in fighting games such as Street Fighter. Shimmy beats throw beats weight, and weight beats shimmy. This is all derived from a strategy that is as simple as walking backwards and forwards in a distance that is less than a full character model, and is something that happens commonly in Street Fighter V and not only leads to considerable damage but often decides rounds. If you're still not convinced, I'd recommend watching a video called Movement Options Define How You Play the Game by Sejam. Despite the video being primarily about fighting games, he makes sure to make the things he talks about applicable to multiple genres. On top of that, I'd like to mention that there has been a debate in the Halo community over a single mobility option, a mechanic that is seen very commonly even across genres, and that mechanic is sprint. This mechanic has such drastic implications on the core design philosophy of Halo that people have been debating its existence for nearly 10 years now, I kid you not. If you're wondering how such a simple mechanic can cause such a divide for such a long time, if you're thinking, how could there possibly be that much to discuss about put gun down, move faster, then I'd invite you to watch some videos by Faven, who is seen as the authority on the mechanic. Links in the description. Hopefully with those examples you can see just how powerful moving very short distances can be, and in Rise, the player can move great distances very quickly with Wirebugs. If you get knocked down, you can do an extra quick rise that moves you away from where you would have been otherwise. It allows you to completely leap out of the danger zone and puts you back on your feet. Previously, you would be forced to take the knockdown and would be put in a position where you have to make a decision. Do you quick rise by inputting character movement, or do you slow rise and take full advantage of the invulnerability provided by staying on the ground? This decision could be the difference between life or death. Now you get to ignore that decision making with the press of a button, once again relying on a flowchart that does not take into consideration what the monster is going to do next. As for the ability to scale the majority of surfaces, it's interesting. If it's balanced correctly, then I really don't see many issues with it. It can aid skilled players traverse the map faster, which is something that doesn't contradict the core of Monster Hunter, and is something everyone has access to regardless of the companions they bring. The big question is how it interacts with monsters. If you can cheese monsters with ranged weapons from within areas they can't reach, then obviously that's an issue. No game's cheese free, even GU has Valor Heavy Bowgun. The idea isn't to remove cheese entirely, but to make it so the player has to at least work for the cheese. As much as you can cheese GU with Valor Heavy Bowgun, it isn't free. You still need to play the game and work for the victory, it's just the cheese makes it significantly easier. I also want to give brief mention to sliding. I don't despise the idea, as the added movement speed is limited to certain areas of the maps. I just hate the idea of accidentally initiating a slide when I'm trying to do other things like Superman dive or charging my hammer. It's a classic case of control being taken away from the player due to context sensitive actions that are accidentally activated. Now I imagine that with the discussion of player power and mobility, you're probably wondering what I have to say about things like Wirebugs and Hunter Arts. Hunter Arts do indeed greatly increase player power and have some very powerful mobility. Combined with Hunter styles, and you have a Monster Hunter game that favours giving players power rather than restricting it. However, it's designed in such a way where it changes very little about the core gameplay. You're not forced to stop attacking the monster to make attacking viable again, unlike the Clutch Claw. It's something that works in tandem with attacking, much like how the Wirebugs are used. However, the difference of the two systems is more intricate than that. Arts in GU are used in tandem with styles, and each weapon has a selection of arts to choose from. Choosing which art to use is as much of a choice as what style to use, and the number of arts each style can equip has a part to play in how powerful each style is for their respective weapons. Striker's Sword and Shield is really strong because it retains the most powerful parts of the weapon's moveset, but also because it can house 3 Hunter Arts, and the Sword and Shield's Hunter Arts are very powerful. Conversely, Aerial Greatsword is quite weak due to it restricting the weapon's moveset to some rather weak attacks, and only allowing 1 Hunter Art. Not that the Greatsword's Hunter Arts are weak, but rather the moveset of Aerial makes the restriction of only 1 Hunter Art seem worse. The number of Hunter Arts allocated to each style makes each style more distinct and balances them out. Since each of the styles follows a certain design philosophy, Aerial is all about mounting, Striker is all about the arts, Adept is all about playing intelligently aggressive, Valor is all about managing a limited power-up, some arts are inherently more powerful than others when ignoring arts. Not only that, but since the player chooses what arts they bring, there are more decisions to be made when selecting weapons. Admittedly, this does make learning a new weapon significantly more complicated, but that increase in things to learn allows players to continue learning new techniques with their weapons for potentially hundreds of hours, and as a result, allows for a much larger range of player expression when it comes to what they choose to bring to a hunt. Because the arts are tied to a weapon, but not forcibly so, if an art needs to be altered, it primarily alters the art, and subsequently alters the decisions made in what arts to bring. While it will alter the effectiveness of a weapon, it also makes choosing Hunter Arts besides the norm more appealing, leading to more viable options at endgame. Meanwhile, the Wirebug attacks in Rise are tied directly to the weapon, meaning that players can't exactly express themselves with the arts they use. And if a Wirebug attack is too powerful and needs to be nerfed, it directly affects the weapon's performance rather than affecting one type of effectiveness the weapon has, while leaving other forms intact. And with no good segue, I'm now going to talk about collectible buffs. There really isn't much to say about this other than you spend time away from the monster to become stronger before fighting the monster, even though you've already started the quest, and gaining the power required to take on the monster should be a part of a player's pre-hunt routine. Balancing this has got to be a nightmare. The people who just want to fight the monster rather staring at the pretty scenery are essentially being punished for trying to complete the main objective. People who want to be fully prepared have to make a detour in their hunt for maximum preparation and as a result take a large hit to their times. And heaven forbid you're someone who's a mixture of the two, or if your hunting party has a mixture of these playstyles. You might end up in a position where the aggressive player is frustrated because their damage output, stamina and health is nerfed for wanting to fight the monster, and the more preparatory player is frustrated that they missed out on so much of the fight while they were gathering buffs to the point where they didn't get to utilize all the power they spent time acquiring. It seems very contradictory for a game that is essentially a boss rush to punish you for picking a fight too fast. This one is very difficult to determine its effects because we really need some solid numbers at endgame to see if it would be more or less worth it to collect the buffs than just rush the monster. Some people see it as an opportunity for creative routing before you engage with a monster, and I can see some players and even some speedrunners finding it engaging. But I imagine it will frustrate a lot of speedrunners too because it could artificially add a lot of time to every attempt repeating the same lengthy route each time before they can even practice the monster. I can't say for sure until post-launch. As I said, it's very dependent on the numbers as to how much it'll influence a player's pre-hunt decision making. With all this being said, I imagine I sound like a classic style fanboy, unable to recognize its downfalls, so I thought it'd be poignant to list some things from classic that I don't like and some things from new that I do. Weapon bouncing sucks. You already do fuck all damage when you connect a hit with insufficient sharpness, and it degrades your sharpness twice as fast to hit those areas. Not only that, but a lot of monsters that have hard parts have a tendency to turn around in such a way where your monster will end up connecting with a hard part mid-swing. Due to the somewhat uncontrollable nature of monsters, it's very difficult to avoid this altogether. On top of that, you get stuck in this incredibly long bouncing animation that allows monsters you just bounced off of to punish you with whatever it feels like. You can't even roll cancel out of the bounce to shorten the recovery, but you can cancel it with another attack, and you can cancel it with another attack super early in the animation, which very commonly leads to situations with fast weapons like the sword and shield where you accidentally input another attack after bouncing, leading you to bounce again, leaving you with no hope of getting out of the bouncing animation before the monster does another attack. There are even some monsters, like Drilltusk Tetsukabra, that seem to be designed to have weapons bounce off them very frequently. It's something that I find goes against the design philosophy of Monster Hunter because of how it's tied to a decision that the player makes, but is something that is very uncontrollable. You control when you heal. Whether it is a good time to do so or not is in the control of the player and their ability to recognize patterns. Bouncing off of a monster that turns around when your attack was mid-swing is just random bullshit that is very difficult to account for and can easily lead to dumb deaths that can't exactly be blamed on the player. Leveling the deviants and their gear in Generations Ultimate takes an age and a half, with each tier of equipment requiring multiple tickets for their respective tiers. With each tier of equipment requiring multiple tickets of their respective tiers, you're required to fight deviants substantially more than any other monster in the game for the same quantity and quality of equipment. To make things more tedious, there are a bunch of tiers. 15 for deviants introduced in Generations, of which there are 12, and 5 for deviants from Ultimate, of which there are 6. And to top it all off, only one deviant has unique music, so have fun listening to the same song on repeat for hours on end for 17 different monsters. Anyone who knows me knows I hate charm RNG in GU. I can never seem to get a charm I actually want and still don't have a Tenderizer plus 5 3 slot after 900 hours of playtime. After a certain point, there's nothing more you can do to improve your odds other than spam the same quest over and over and pray you get lucky. I don't get lucky, so I just don't get to use the builds I want to. While I do prefer that charms are tied to RNG rather than decorations, it would be nice to be able to guarantee that you're always progressing towards getting the charms you desire. The system I always talk about is a way of upgrading charms by fusing duplicates. If you have 2 Tenderizer plus 1 charms, you can fuse them together to get a Tenderizer plus 2 charm. If you have a Tenderizer plus 3 charm, you need 2 Tenderizer plus 2 charms. You can even have the restriction that you can only upgrade the primary skill and can't influence the number of slots the charm has. Literally anything is better than the pure RNG of charms in GU. And if this system were to exist, I would actually have a Tenderizer plus 5 3 slot. But because it doesn't, I don't. We all know the sheer meme that is the Plesioth hip check. And while hitboxes have only been getting better, they're still far from perfect. While the Plesioth hip check is less of a meme now, it's still a joke. And let's not forget about certain beam attacks that just ignore geometry and hit you even though you're taking cover behind a rock.
It's fine. Oh! Unless he shoots through the wall! He shot through the wall!
I'm not going to pretend that geometry checks like that are easy. I can only imagine they're incredibly difficult and potentially very janky to implement, but it's still an issue. If the player is clearly blocking the line of sight of an attack, they should not be punished for assuming that their eyes told them that the attack physically could not hurt them. 1-frame attacks. What are they? They're attacks that have 0 frames of startup, as in their hitboxes are active from frame 1 of the attack. What do they look like? When Yangaruga runs forward, when Teostra leaps forward, when Tigrex charges forward. These are all instances of very damaging attacks that send the player flying as if they've been hit by a Bullfango, but the attacks have no animation tied to them to show the player that the monster is about to throw out that attack. In other words, they are unreactable. And for a game that has such a heavy emphasis on the player reacting to the game accordingly, this just seems incredibly archaic and poor design to have in Monster Hunter. Having infinite pickaxes and bugnets could easily be seen as a reduction on the emphasis of preparation. However, pickaxes and bugnets rarely have any effect on how you fight a monster. Also, because you have to buy them with Zenny, you can only carry so many at any given time, and they can break, forcing you to cut your expedition in short in order to buy more. It seems like it's simply an exercise in slowing down the gathering process of Monster Hunter, something that constitutes the early stages of low rank, high rank, and G rank. If you find yourself in need of materials from the early stages of these ranks, you already have to dedicate a decent chunk of time seeking them out, rather than fighting monsters. So why have this extra aspect to increase the time further? Having infinite pickaxes and bugnets has little to no effect on the core gameplay loop of Monster Hunter. It just speeds up the gathering process, something that a lot of players, including myself, find extremely tedious, as we just want to get back to fighting monsters. Melding in World makes it significantly easier to acquire the rarer resources you're looking for by trading the more common resources you have in high quantity. It simply gives the player more control over the rate at which they acquire materials and subsequently new gear. The ability to keep track of how many materials you have in relation to how many you need is something that only improves the playing experience. Having to manually keep track of that stuff does not have an effect on the gameplay of Monster Hunter and only makes it awkward to do so. Most people go to the blacksmith to see if they have the required materials or not. Having a wish list that gives you the information you need quickly simply makes the process faster and more convenient. I understand that this is a similar train of thought that people have about base camps, but hopefully throughout this video you've come to understand how that's just not true. Speeding up menu interaction is a quality of life improvement. Altering the core gameplay by allowing the player to swap equipment and ignoring the need for good preparation skills is not. Wishlists speed up menu interaction. Instead of heading to the blacksmith to interact with a menu to see if you have the required materials, you save the hassle by simply being told whether or not you do upon entering the village. Weapon trees have always existed, but they've never been visible to this degree. Previously, you'd either have to spend a long time in menus in-game, or you'd go to an external source to be able to see the full weapon tree. World essentially took the weapon trees that existed outside the game and put them inside the game. I'm not really a fan of having to leave a game to learn more about the game, especially when it comes to the more basic stuff like weapon upgrades, as I can kind of forgive the more complex and hidden things like motion values and individual moves being hidden from the player and requiring external resources. There's a fine balance for the amount of information a game gives to its players. It might sound silly, but a game that reveals all of its information to its players is a game where it becomes very easy to become very knowledgeable. And since knowledge is power, it becomes a game where it's very easy to become very powerful, and suddenly you have a game that has to cater its base level of challenge around players having all the knowledge the game has to offer. One of the great things about Monster Hunter is that there is a large variety of skill levels that can play the game at endgame and have a very enjoyable experience. You don't have to be a pro player to be able to enjoy everything the game has to offer. If you are, then you can push the game even further and take on even greater challenges. The game gives you the option, rather than forcing you to play at the highest level. And now it's time to talk about the things I'm neutral about, either because I just don't know enough about the effects of the mechanic, or because neither classic style nor new style have a distinct enough advantage over the other for me to be able to determine which is better. Displaying the amount of sharpness the player has rather than the type helps you to know how long it will be before sharpening becomes necessary, reducing some levels of uncertainty in not knowing how much sharpness you have left within a sharpness level, causing you to use a whetstone when maybe you didn't need to. The only thing on the other side of the aisle is that the player can get a feel for how much sharpness they have left simply by putting the time in and paying attention. I don't really have a problem with this, but if you're one to swap out your weapons frequently, it definitely makes this process of getting a feel for sharpness levels harder. Knowing that I'm a classic fan, you might be surprised to see this in the things I'm neutral about segment. But that's because neither version is strictly better than the other, it's about how they're implemented. Having a physical space between zones creates a greater sense of immersion due to the fact that traversal isn't being interrupted by loading screens. It also means that fights are not interrupted in the same way, such as being booped into a loading screen, or monsters blipping out of existence preventing you from really chasing them down. However, if you have a physical space between the zones, then you have to physically traverse it, as opposed to one loading screen allowing you to get from one end of the map to the other in an instant. If you want a shortcut, you have to create the physical space for the shortcut. With loading screens, you can create any shortcut you want and simply put a loading screen in the middle. The zones don't have to physically connect in any way. This also allows you to create the illusion of a map being much larger than it is. For example, you can have structures off in the far distance in the background of one zone, and when you travel through a loading screen, what appeared to be miles away, you are now in the middle of. It creates the illusion of scale without having to create the physical space for it. Maps like the Desert from Freedom, the Dunes from 4U, and the Misty Peaks from Portable Third, just to name a few, utilize this effect very well to create the illusion of traversing a very large environment. Whereas with a physical space, what you see is what you get. There's nothing beyond that mountain because if there was, surely you'd physically be able to go there. As a last note on the zones, having loading screens makes it easier to run away from monsters and can cause you to get booped out of zones in the middle of the fight, interrupting the flow. Having physical space between zones can also make it easy to run away from the monsters, depending on the environment and the behavior of said monsters, allowing the possibility to cheese them from just outside the zone. Generally, these physical spaces are narrow corridors, so if a monster decides to follow you down one and have a fight there, you'll be fighting in a corner the entire time, with the monster taking up the majority of your camera and having its moveset be thrown out of balance due to the inability to move freely. A monster like Mizitsune tends to move great distances in short times during its attack patterns. Being pressed up against a wall prevents this and may cause shenanigans to occur. This isn't entirely avoidable, as every zone, even in classic titles, have walls, but it can occur more frequently when the spaces between zones are narrow corridors and the monster can and will fight you in those narrow spaces, making combat very awkward. There's no perfect solution to this. The best thing to do is to choose a style and create it to the best of your ability. And honestly, the map from the beta was quite good and was the reason why I had to rethink the loading screens between zones stance I used to have, since I believe Will did a very poor job of using physical space between zones. But that is a tangent that deserves its own video, so let's move on. If previous games had more of an emphasis on limited Whetstones, then I'd be more inclined to talk negatively about them being infinite in new style. However, classic style allows you to hold up to 20 at a time, which is more than enough for even the more sharpness hungry weapons like dual blades and gun lance. And honestly, I'm glad there wasn't a huge emphasis on it, because it affects the core gameplay loop. Having poor sharpness seriously hurts the player, regardless of how good or bad they are. It's essentially an upkeep cost for maintaining your weapon's power. And limiting the number of Whetstones doesn't really change the cost, since it's less of a cost of an item and more of a cost of time. Using a Whetstone mid-battle is very difficult and will likely get you killed, even in new style if you decide to commit to it. So having Whetstones isn't something I have an issue with. However, I do still take issue with being able to roll cancel out of it at nearly any time, but we've discussed that in length already. Having to cycle through items until you find the right item is time consuming. Having the item you are most likely to want to use next already being selected in the item menu, along with good organization of item pouch, will greatly reduce this time. Being able to select an item from a radial menu is even faster. While this does slightly lower the need for good preparation, I don't think it's a huge detriment, since it still requires you to spend time not fighting the monster in order to navigate. And I like to think that it encourages players to use a wider variety of items rather than a small handful, putting more emphasis on having said items in your pouch and by proxy emphasizing preparation slightly more. What I do not like is the ability to craft through the radial menu, as crafting is something that is meant to be cumbersome. It's a mechanic that allows you to generate more uses of a particular item in the field, which can range from the mundane to the highly powerful and desirable, such as max potions and ammo. If crafting is as easy as opening the radial menu, then it seems to me that the requirement of sacrificing immediate battle readiness for future battle readiness is heavily weighted towards the future battle readiness. I mean, it always has been. Players who know how to use created space to be able to craft in classic titles could easily make use of a lot of very powerful items. But because it was all in the menus, it made the process harder, creating a new skill that players can master if they want to push their ability to play the game. The ability to craft in menus is yet another example of new style Monster Hunter reducing the skill gap of their game. I understand wanting to lower the skill floor to make it easier for new players to enjoy the game without coming up against several walls in the form of the system itself, rather than the monsters the player has put up against. But I do not think that this should come at the cost of lowering the skill ceiling too. There are ways of accommodating for both new and veteran players, where the skill floor is lowered but the skill ceiling remains as intact as possible. A game that could be easy to learn, hard to master, rather than what it was in classic titles, which was hard to learn, hard to master. While I and many other players don't mind spending a lot of time learning a game, the general audience is less inclined. But while the general audience does not mind a game that is easy to master, players like myself will grow bored of the game quickly if there's nothing else to grab our attention. Until the game comes out, I don't know what Armour Skills will look like in Rise. So instead, I am going to talk about how Armour Skills work in Classic compared to New from a design standpoint. Armour Skills in GU are designed in such a way that limit the total number of armor skills each set can have, but each skill gives potent effects, meaning you really have to pick and choose your skills rather than having a bit of everything, to specialize rather than generalize. Not only that, but you can end up with negative skills, so doing some maths is very beneficial for making powerful sets, or use maths that other people have done and use similar sets. They're designed in such a way in which mixing and matching skills is in of itself its own skill that enables players to create some very powerful sets, and not just from an offensive standpoint either. As an example, this is my defensive set. It utilizes the full Golden Loon Z set and replaces the gauntlets with the Event Crimson Fatalis gauntlets, the Fatalis Crimson Claws XR. This grants me a total of 888 defense at base, a number that is quite high and quite potent in GU, along with Guts, Rationer, Razor Sharp, Resentment, and Benediction, which is a compound skill that gives Divine Blessing and Recovery up. Basically, I have solid defense, increased damage when I have red recoverable health, I can't be one-shot by even the most powerful moves, my healing items restore more health and even have a 25% chance to not be consumed, while also having a 25% chance to reduce damage taken by 30%. It's pretty beefy and it's very efficient with its healing, except against thunder monsters, that's its biggest weakness, but it's a very tight build requiring a good charm, sharpness +5 3 slot, and a weapon with 3 slots, which usually don't offer the most damage output. In World, however, it's a lot more weighted towards having a lot of different skills rather than getting the most out of a handful, to generalize rather than specialize. Because gaining skills is done with the widgets rather than reaching a certain point threshold, it makes it significantly easier to have everything you want. Because it was so much easier to get everything a set needed, it became the norm and fed into the focus on meta that World suffered from in the later parts of its lifespan. If you thought mounting was powerful in Generations Ultimate with aerial style, then oh boy, you haven't seen the mounting in Rise. I gotta be honest, I'm not even sure what the mounting is in Rise. If two monsters interact with each other, you get a freebie and it turns into Rise into Stories, which is to say, it turns into a Pokemon battle of you beating the living shit out of each other with the other monster by spamming the heavy attack until they fall over. I would be very surprised if it didn't get some numbers tweaked before launch, but because it's so different to what mounting is right now, and because I don't know enough about it, I honestly can't make heads or tails of it. I personally don't like it because it seems to cheese the monsters, and if you don't have two monsters to interact with each other, it seems to be really difficult to get a mount. But it's so hard to say if it makes Monster Hunter as a whole worse, that I think this is one of those cases where I'm gonna have to wait and see how it pans out in full release. As of right now, I don't know how tracking will be done in Rise. However, I can talk about paintballs versus scoutflies versus the demo's tracking. As much as I don't have a huge problem with paintballs, it can be frustrating to have to play a guessing game of where the monster spawns before you can start tracking it. Once you do know, and you know its habits, the paintball becomes optional and you can rely on your knowledge to carry you to where you need to go. The supplement for these problems, however, is Psycho Serums. Once again, optional, but they eliminate the need to guess where the monster spawns by using one at the start of a hunt. Learning how each monster behaves in relation to the map, in addition to the map itself, is a skill that gets tested once the player enters high rank, where the map item isn't given out at the start of a hunt, forcing you to rely on your memory. While hiding the map is a relic from an older generations, I really like that with the Provision Division in Generations Ultimate, you can spend a small amount of points to have a map delivered to the item box right at the start of the quest for those who get lost easily, having yet another feature for those who are more diligent with their options and choices, as in those with good preparation skills. Scoutflies, on the other hand, don't have a traditional off button. They'll take control of the player's camera to a comical extent to make sure the player is fully aware of where the monster is going at all times. Curiously, you can only properly track the monster after collecting enough points from said monster, which if you know where the monster spawns, means you'll be consistently fighting the monster where it spawns before the game can tell you where it spawns, resulting in the feature becoming quickly redundant after a few successful runs against the monster. The tracking in the demo is also confusing from a design standpoint, as all monsters are permanently pinned to the map. No need to learn where they spawn or their movement habits, because the game tells you where they are at all times. However, the monster is unknown until you spot it, so even though all monsters are on the map, theoretically you don't know which one is your target. That is until you memorize which question mark is the one, much like in older titles, but then the guesswork is completely removed. Even if the monster moves in an unusual pattern that deviates from the norm, you'll never lose sight of it. Tracking is not the most important feature to the Monster Hunter franchise, not by a long shot, but much like everything else, it plays a part. Just not one that has me foaming at the mouth like some of the other mechanics mentioned in this video. Having environmental hazards in the way that hot areas and cold areas function in Monster Hunter is a great way to make a player consider their options when exploring an area without just increasing the frequency or difficulty of the combat encounters. However, Monster Hunter is not an exploration game. It has exploration aspects, but is primarily a combat-driven game. Sheer Cold in Genshin Impact works well because it alters the way the player interacts with the area around them and the encounters within them. You can ignite sconces to create a source of heat to reduce the effects, or even find particular stones in the field that can revert some of the effects for a limited time, while passing through bodies of water increases the effects. The game uses its environment as a gameplay feature rather than just the area in which combat takes place. Monster Hunter is the opposite. While reducing the need for hot drinks and cool drinks does reduce the need for good preparatory skills, I think that the way these items interact with the game is very limited. Either you use the item to completely ignore the effects of the area for a while, or you suffer the full effects of the area. There's no in between and no other way to interact with the environment or its hazards. The ability to apply blights to monsters has such drastic implications, most of which rely heavily on numerical data for things like damage over time, amplifying damage dealt by the player, etc. We really have no idea how powerful this system will be until we see it in action in endgame. Not only that, but because it's so heavily reliant on numbers, it can easily be buffed or nerfed accordingly if balance issues do occur. This system is so alien to me that trying to understand how it affects the rest of the game is a feat that is just too great a task for me right now. All I can do is wait and see, but if it's busted, I'm likely to make a video dedicated to it. And with that, this video comes to a close. Once again, this wasn't really a video that was designed to stir up shit, it was more of a video to explain why I'm not interested in this Monster Hunter title, despite it being the next entry in the Monster Hunter title. You can feel however you want about the game. If you enjoy it, then I can't stop you, I can't change that. You do what you do, you know, there's no issues with that. But I hope at the very least this video has been entertaining, if not informative, of my perspective on this game. I'd like to give a big thank you to my friend RedTriton for lending me a bunch of footage, as I've been on a very tight time budget recently. So tight in fact that I'm going to be giving YouTube a break for a while. Not leaving, just a break. I've got a lot of other stuff that I need to do, and YouTube is one hell of a time sink. There might be the occasional stream highlight or an installment of Fighting to Improve, but for all intents and purposes, I will not be making any significant content for the channel for quite some time. My degree comes first. So I'd like to thank you very much for watching this monster of a video, and I'll catch you next time. This is something the series has historically been very... Fucking hell, that's a lot of S's. This is something the series has historically... Fucking hell, that's a lot of S's. This is something the series has historically been very good at. Nailed it.